Officer Miller never imagined his final few months, before retirement, would be spent obsessing over a dog. The town of Havenwood was a quiet place, a slow river of routines where one day bled into the next, and that was exactly how Miller liked it. The bus stop on Elm Street was just another landmark on his patrol, a simple glass shelter where teenagers huddled in the rain and elderly women waited patiently for the 2:15 to the downtown market. It seemed harmless, a monument to the mundane. But the dog's unwavering vigil hinted otherwise. For 3 weeks, the scruffy, golden-haired mutt had been there, a statue of perfect loyalty. He'd arrive just before the first bus at dawn and leave only after the last one hissed to a stop after dusk. Miller's first assumption, the one everyone in town shared, was that the dog was waiting for an owner who would never return. A sad, simple story. But his behavior was all wrong. He ignored the kind strangers who offered him food, turning his head away from outstretched hands holding pieces of sausage or bread. He paid no mind to the people getting off the bus, his gaze fixed not on their faces, but on the closing doors, a look of profound, repeating disappointment in his amber eyes. When a particularly bad thunderstorm rolled in, shaking the very foundations of the town, Miller watched the dog press himself against the glass of the shelter, trembling but resolute, refusing to seek better cover. That's when Miller realized the truth was far more complex. What his investigation would later reveal left him, a man who hadn't cried in 30 years, utterly broken. This was no ordinary lost pet, it was a silent, desperate scream for help. If you've ever felt that a creature without a voice was trying to tell you something important, you need to hear this story. Stick with me, and I promise you'll understand. The first day Miller noticed him was a Tuesday. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the morning sun cast long, lazy shadows across the pavement. The dog was sitting perfectly straight, his tail tucked neatly around his paws, his posture radiating a sense of purpose that seemed almost human. Miller slowed his patrol car, expecting to see an owner nearby, perhaps an elderly man fumbling for change, or a child tying a shoe. But there was no one. Just the dog, the empty bench, and the quiet hum of the town waking up. He made a note of it, stray, medium-sized, golden mix, no collar, and drove on. By Friday, the dog had become a fixture. Miller started calling him Hachi, a private joke referencing the famous loyal dog from Japan. This Hachi, however, wasn't at a train station, he was guarding a suburban bus stop with the solemnity of a soldier at a tomb. The locals had noticed him too. Mrs. Gable from the bakery across the street had taken to leaving a bowl of water out, which the dog would gratefully drink from when he thought no one was watching, but he never touched the food she left beside it. He's grieving, she told Miller, her voice thick with sympathy. Poor dear. Probably waiting for his person. Heartbreaking, isn't it? Miller had nodded, agreeing because it was the easiest thing to do. It was the story that made sense, the one that fit neatly into a box of sad, but understandable animal behavior. Yet, something about it gnawed at him. Grieving dogs were often listless, depressed. This dog was anything but. He was vigilant. His ears swiveled at the slightest sound, his head tracking every vehicle that passed, but his full, undivided attention was reserved for the city bus. Each time it approached, a low rumble preceding its arrival, the dog would rise to his paws, his body tense with anticipation. He would watch the hydraulic doors swing open, his eyes scanning the empty space of the doorway, and as the doors folded shut again, a visible deflation would ripple through him. He would let out a low, almost inaudible whine before settling back into his seated watch. It wasn't the behavior of a dog waiting for a familiar scent or face among the disembarking passengers. It was something else, something Miller couldn't yet define. His partner, a young, eager officer named Evans, thought it was a waste of time. It's just a dog, Frank, he'd said, tapping his fingers on the dashboard. Animal control will pick him up eventually, but they hadn't. Calls had been made, of course. The first 2 times, the dog had vanished moments before the van arrived, melting into the thick woods behind the residential street, as if he'd sensed their approach. The third time, he'd allowed the officer to loop a leash around his neck, but as he was led toward the van, he dug his paws into the grass, lowered his body, and refused to budge, his eyes locked on the bus stop with such desperate, pleading intensity that the officer, a soft-hearted man named Dave, hadn't had the heart to force him. He'd unclipped the leash and left, telling dispatch the dog was non-aggressive and seemed to be on a mission. The story circulated, and the dog of Elm Street became a local legend, a symbol of unwavering faith. For Miller, however, the legend was becoming an obsession. He started timing his patrols to coincide with the bus schedule. He watched the dog's ritual play out over and over. The rise, the hopeful tension, the searching gaze, the quiet fall of disappointment. He noticed the dog wasn't just watching any bus, he was specifically focused on the number 7, the one that ran a long, meandering route out to the semi-rural edge of the county and back. He ignored the express bus to the city and the local crosstown shuttle. It was only the number 7 that commanded his absolute, soul-deep attention. This specificity was the detail that unraveled the simple grief narrative for Miller. A grieving dog wouldn't care about the route number. A lost dog would be scanning faces, sniffing the air. This dog was watching a machine, a system, a schedule. It was a logic that felt strangely intelligent, and deeply, profoundly unsettling. He was trying to communicate something, Miller was sure of it. The bus was a symbol, a message he was broadcasting to a world that only saw a sad, lonely pet. The weather turned on the 1st of October. A cold, biting rain began to fall, driven by a wind that stripped the last of the autumn leaves from the trees and sent them skittering across the asphalt like frightened animals. The sky was a bruised, purple-gray canvas, and the world seemed to shrink, huddled and miserable. Miller felt the chill deep in his bones, a familiar ache that reminded him of his age. He saw the dog, Hatchie, pressed against the back of the glass shelter, his fur darkened and matted by the relentless downpour. He was shivering, not violently, but with a steady, exhausting tremor that spoke of deep-set cold. Yet he remained. His gaze, unwavering, was still fixed on the road, waiting for the telltale headlights of the number 7. Miller pulled his cruiser to the curb, the wipers beating a frantic rhythm against the glass. He had a thick wool blanket in the trunk, one he kept for emergencies. On impulse, he got out, the cold rain soaking his uniform jacket in seconds. "Hey, buddy," he said softly, approaching the shelter. The dog's ears flattened, and a low growl rumbled in his chest, but he didn't move. He just watched Miller with wary, intelligent eyes. Miller stopped a few feet away, holding up his empty hands. "Easy now. Just want to help." He slowly unfolded the blanket, and laid it on the dry part of the bench inside the shelter. The dog watched his every move, his growl subsiding but his suspicion remaining. Miller backed away and got back into his car, watching through the rain-streaked windshield. For a long time, the dog ignored the offering. He remained on the cold, wet concrete, a miserable sentinel. But as another hour passed and the temperature continued to drop, he finally relented. He cautiously sniffed the blanket, circled it twice and then, with a heavy sigh, curled up on it, tucking his nose under his tail. He was still shivering, but less so. He had accepted the help, but his eyes never left the road. That small act of trust, that shared moment of vulnerability against the storm, changed something in Miller. The dog was no longer a curiosity, or a local legend, he was a responsibility. The next day, the rain had eased to a miserable drizzle, but the cold had intensified. Miller brought a thermos of warm beef broth, pouring some into a bowl and leaving it beside the shelter. This time, the dog drank it immediately, lapping it up with a desperate thirst before looking up at Miller's cruiser with what the officer could have sworn was a flicker of gratitude. He still wouldn't eat solid food, but the broth seemed to give him a sliver of strength. The bond between them grew in this silent, unspoken way. Miller would park his car for long stretches, the engine rumbling softly, a quiet companion to the dog's lonely vigil. He learned the subtle shifts in the dog's posture. He could see the hope that flared with each approaching bus and the crushing weight of despair that followed. It was a cycle of resilience and heartbreak, played out every 45 minutes, from dawn until deep into the night. One afternoon, Evans found Miller just sitting there, watching the dog. "Frank, you've been here for an hour," he said, his voice a mix of concern and exasperation. "We've got calls backing up." Miller didn't take his eyes off the dog. "There's something wrong here, kid. I can feel it. It's a dog waiting for its owner," Evans repeated, the official town theory. "It's sad, but it's not a police matter." "It is," Miller said, his voice low and certain. "He's not waiting. He's trying to tell us something. Look at him. He's not looking at the people. He's looking for a way out. Or a way in. I don't know which," Evans sighed, shaking his head. He saw a man on the verge of retirement getting sentimental over a stray. Miller saw a puzzle, and he felt a growing, chilling certainty that the answer was a matter of life and death. The breaking point came on a Thursday, nearly a month after the vigil began. A severe weather alert was issued for Havenwood and the surrounding counties. An early winter storm was blowing in, promising freezing rain that would turn to heavy, wet snow by nightfall. The temperature was projected to plummet, creating life-threatening conditions for anyone caught outside. Miller knew the dog wouldn't survive a night like that. His fur was thick, but he was already weakened by weeks of exposure and poor nutrition. The broth wasn't enough. As Miller began his evening shift, the first icy pellets began to tap against his windshield. The streets were emptying as people hurried home to the warmth of their houses. But when he drove past the bus stop on Elm, the dog was still there, a lone, stubborn figure against the encroaching storm. The wool blanket was soaked through, offering little comfort. The wind was picking up, whipping around the corner of the shelter with a mournful howl. This time, something was different. As Miller's cruiser approached, the dog didn't just watch him. He stood up, stepped out from under the shelter into the freezing rain, and barked. It wasn't a warning bark, or an aggressive one. It was a sharp, frantic, demanding sound. He barked directly at Miller's car, then turned his head and looked down the road, in the direction the number 7 bus would take as it left the town center, then looked back at Miller and barked again. It was the most direct communication he had ever initiated. It was an undeniable summons. "Okay, buddy," Miller whispered to himself, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. "Okay. I hear you." He pulled the car over, his heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and adrenaline. He flicked on his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I'm going to be off radio for a bit." Pursuing a lead on Elm Street, there was a crackle of static and then the dispatcher's confused voice. "A lead, 12. What kind of lead?" Miller looked at the dog, who was now trotting a few feet down the road, looking back over his shoulder, urging him to follow. "The four-legged kind," Miller said, and switched off the radio before she could question him further. He put the car in drive, his headlights cutting through the growing twilight. The dog, seeing the car begin to move, let out another sharp bark and started to run. Not a sprint, but a steady, determined trot, leading the way into the storm and into the heart of a mystery that was about to shatter a quiet town's peace. The dog led him away from the well-lit main streets of Havenwood, turning down a narrow lane that quickly devolved into a poorly maintained service road. The freezing rain was coming down harder now, glazing the asphalt and making the cruiser's tires slip. Miller had to drive at a crawl to keep from losing control, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The dog stayed just ahead, a golden phantom in the beams of the headlights, his pace unwavering. He seemed to know these back roads intimately, navigating the dark, forgotten corners of the town with an unnerving confidence. They passed the old cannery, its windows boarded up, and its brick facade covered in graffiti. They went by the abandoned freight yard, where rusted train cars sat like sleeping iron beasts. This was the part of town that didn't make it onto postcards, the skeletal remains of a more prosperous time. Miller felt a growing unease. Every instinct he had honed over 30 years on the force was screaming that this was wrong. He was following a dog into a desolate, industrial wasteland during a dangerous storm. It was illogical, insane. He should turn back, call animal control, let them handle it. But then he would look at the dog. The animal's determination was a physical force. It radiated from his small, trotting body, a beacon of pure, desperate purpose. He never faltered, never looked back with uncertainty. He was leading Miller to something, and Miller, against all logic, had to know what it was. The road turned from cracked pavement to gravel, and then to a muddy, rutted track. Tree branches, heavy with ice, scraped against the sides of the cruiser. Miller was forced to slow down even more, the car lurching through deep, water-filled potholes. The dog, however, moved with agility, weaving through the treacherous terrain, as if he'd run this path 1,000 times. He was a creature possessed by a singular mission. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 minutes, the dog turned sharply off the track, disappearing into a thicket of overgrown bushes. Miller stopped the car, its headlights cutting a swath through the dense, tangled woods. He couldn't follow in the vehicle. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the relentless ticking of ice against the roof and the howling of the wind. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight from the passenger seat, pulled the collar of his jacket up around his ears, and stepped out into the storm. The cold was a physical blow. The wind tore at him, and the icy rain stung his face. He shone the flashlight beam into the thicket where the dog had vanished. For a terrifying moment, there was nothing. Then, 2 amber eyes reflected the light, and a low bark echoed from within the trees. It was a call, this way. Hurry. Taking a deep breath, Miller pushed his way through the wet, thorny branches, his uniform catching and tearing. The ground was slick with mud and decaying leaves. He followed the sound of the dog's occasional barks, which served as a guide through the oppressive darkness. The woods were dense and disorienting, and without the dog, he would have been hopelessly lost in seconds. He was operating on pure faith now, a faith placed in a creature he couldn't speak to, a faith that went against every rule and regulation he'd ever followed. Finally, the trees thinned, and he found himself in a small, neglected clearing. In the center of it stood a house, or what was left of one. It was a small, dilapidated bungalow, its paint peeled away by years of sun and rain, its porch sagging precariously. A shutter hung from a single hinge, banging against the side of the house in the wind like a frantic, rhythmic drumbeat. The place looked utterly abandoned, a hollowed-out shell that had been surrendered to nature long ago. This, Miller thought with a sinking heart, was a dead end. The dog had led him to a ruin. Maybe he was just a stray who lived here, and this whole chase had been a fool's errand. But the dog's behavior said otherwise. He wasn't seeking shelter. He was at the front door, a flimsy piece of wood that looked like it would crumble at a hard push. He was scratching at it frantically, his claws making rasping sounds against the decaying timber. He would scratch, then whine, then turn and look at Miller, his eyes wide with a desperate urgency that was almost human. He was practically vibrating with a need to get inside. Miller's training kicked in, pushing aside his disappointment. He approached the house cautiously, his flashlight beam sweeping across the front. The windows were caked with years of grime, opaque and dark. There were no lights on inside, no signs of life. Yet the dog's insistence was impossible to ignore. "What is it, boy?" Miller murmured, his voice snatched away by the wind. "What's in there?" He stepped onto the groaning porch, testing the boards with his weight. He moved to the nearest window, and wiped away a patch of dirt with his gloved hand, pressing his face close to the cold, wavy glass. He shone his flashlight inside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a scene of profound neglect. Dust lay thick on every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like ghostly chandeliers. The room was sparsely furnished with broken, mismatched furniture. It was the picture of abandonment he had expected. He was about to turn away, to finally concede that this was a mistake, when his light caught something on the far wall. It was a drawing, taped to the peeling wallpaper. A child's drawing, done in bright, cheerful crayon. It depicted a smiling stick figure, a large, golden dog, and a house. Underneath, in shaky, block letters, was the word home, and then he saw it. On the floor, beneath the drawing, was a small, worn-out sneaker. His blood ran cold. He moved the flashlight beam slowly across the room, his heart hammering against his ribs. He saw a pile of blankets on a threadbare mattress in the corner. And from that pile of blankets, something moved. It was a small hand, pale and thin, twitching feebly before falling back into stillness. Time seemed to stop. The wind, the rain, the cold, it all faded away, replaced by a singular, roaring focus. A child was in there. A child was in that house. Miller spun around, his radio already in his hand. He fumbled with the buttons, his fingers numb with cold and shock. Dispatch, this is Miller. I have a 10 to 99, possible child endangerment. I need backup and an ambulance at my location. Now? He tried to give his location, but he was so deep in the woods, so far off any marked road, that the GPS was struggling. I'm off the old service road behind the cannery. In the woods. Send everyone. I'm going in. He didn't wait for a response. He turned back to the door. The dog was still there, whining, his body trembling with a desperate energy. Okay, buddy, Miller said, his voice thick with emotion. Okay. We're getting in. He put his shoulder to the door and pushed. It barely budged, the old wood swollen shut by the damp. He slammed his shoulder into it again, grunting with the effort. The frame groaned in protest. He took a few steps back, took a deep breath of the freezing air, and charged, putting all his weight and all his desperation into the impact. With a splintering crack, the lock gave way, and the door flew open, slamming against the inside wall. Miller stumbled into the darkness, the smell of dust, damp, and sickness hitting him like a physical wall. He swept his flashlight beam across the room, finding the mattress in the corner. The child, a little boy who looked to be no more than 5 or 6 years old, was curled into a tight ball, his face ashen, his lips tinged with blue. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and faint. The dog, Buster, as Miller would later learn his name was, rushed past him, leaping onto the mattress and beginning to lick the boy's face, nudging him gently with his nose, a low, continuous whine coming from deep in his chest. It was a sound of profound love and terror. Miller knelt beside the mattress, his flashlight beam illuminating the scene that would be seared into his memory forever. Next to the boy were 2 bowls. One was a plastic water dish, bone dry. The other was a dog's food bowl, also empty, but licked so clean it shone in the light. In that instant, Miller understood everything. The dog hadn't been waiting for his owner to come home. He hadn't been grieving. He had been trying to get help. He had been trying to lead someone, anyone, to this house. His refusal of food from strangers wasn't about grief. It was because he was bringing his own meals back here, sharing his food with the little boy, trying to keep him alive. The vigil at the bus stop, it was the only way he knew how to interact with the outside world, the only place people gathered. He wasn't trying to get someone off the bus, he was trying to get on it, or maybe get someone to follow him from it, to follow him home. His desperation had grown with each passing day, as the boy's strength faded. Miller felt a wave of hot tears blur his vision, a raw, painful sob catching in his throat. He, a hardened cop who had seen the worst of humanity, was completely undone by the silent, heroic loyalty of this animal. He gently touched the boy's neck, searching for a pulse. It was there, a weak, thready flutter beneath his cold skin. He was alive. Just barely. Miller shrugged off his heavy, rain-soaked jacket and wrapped it around the boy's small, frail body, trying to transfer some of his own warmth. "Hold on, son," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Help is coming. You just have to hold on." He could hear the distant wail of sirens now, a beautiful, welcome sound cutting through the storm. They were getting closer. Backup was on its way. He looked at Buster, who had not stopped nuzzling the boy, his warm breath fogging in the cold air. The dog looked up at Miller, and their eyes met. In that gaze, Miller saw a depth of intelligence, of love, and of suffering that he had never witnessed before. There were no words, but the message was as clear as a shout. "Thank you." The next few minutes were a blur of controlled chaos. 2 patrol cars and an ambulance somehow navigated the muddy track, their flashing red and blue lights painting the desolate woods in surreal, strobing colors. Paramedics rushed in with a gurney and medical kits, their voices calm and professional as they worked on the child, stabilizing him, hooking him up to and for, wrapping him in thermal blankets. Miller gave them a quick, clipped report, his voice hoarse. Evans was there, his young face pale with shock as he took in the scene, the squalor, the sick child, the devoted dog who refused to leave his side. He looked at Miller with a new kind of respect. "You were right, Frank," he said quietly. "My God, you were right." As the paramedics carried the boy, whose name they learned was Leo, out to the ambulance, Buster tried to follow, letting out a sharp, anxious bark. "It's okay, boy," one of the paramedics said. "He's going to be okay," but the dog was having none of it. He needed to be with his boy. Miller knelt down and put a hand on the dog's head, scratching behind his ears. "I'll take him," Miller told the paramedic. "He can ride with me. We'll follow you to the hospital." At the hospital, the story began to come together in horrifying detail. Leo's mother, a single mom named Sarah, had suffered a sudden, catastrophic brain aneurysm nearly a month ago while at the grocery store. She had collapsed and been rushed to the regional hospital in the next county, where she lay in a coma, her identity unknown for the first few days. No one knew she had a son at home. There were no close family members in town, no emergency contacts listed in her wallet. She and Leo had just moved to Havenwood a few months prior, renting the isolated, run-down house because it was all they could afford. They were invisible. No one at Leo's new school had raised an alarm for days. A tragic oversight in a system overwhelmed with transient families. For 27 days, Leo had been alone. Alone, except for Buster. The dog had been his lifeline. When the food in the house ran out, Buster had started foraging, bringing back whatever scraps he could find. When Leo grew too weak to get water, Buster had guided him, nudged him, and stayed by his side. And when he realized that wasn't enough, that Leo was fading, he had started his mission. Every morning, he had walked the 2 miles to the bus stop on Elm Street, the place he had seen Sarah use every day to go to her cleaning job. It was his only known link to the world of help, to the world of people. He had waited, day after day, in heat and rain and cold, for someone to understand. He had waited for someone to follow him home. Miller sat in the sterile, brightly lit waiting room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Buster lay at his feet, his head on his paws, but his eyes were fixed on the double doors leading to the emergency room. He was still on watch. A nurse came out, her face kind. "He's a very lucky boy," she said to Miller. "Severe dehydration, malnutrition, but his core temperature is stabilizing. The doctors think he's going to make a full recovery. You got to him just in time." Another night in that cold, she trailed off, shaking her head. "That dog saved his life." Miller looked down at Buster, whose tail gave a weak thump against the linoleum floor. "Yeah," Miller said, his voice thick. "Yeah, he did." Days turned into weeks. Leo slowly recovered in the pediatric ward. His mother, Sarah, tragically, never woke up from her coma. She passed away peacefully without ever knowing the nightmare her son had endured or the miracle that had saved him. The town of Havenwood, shaken from its quiet complacency, rallied around the little boy and his heroic dog. Donations poured in. A foster family was found, a kind couple who lived on a small farm just outside of town. But through it all, Leo's deepest connection remained with two souls, his dog, Buster, and the quiet, weary police officer who had listened when no one else did. Miller was a constant visitor at the hospital. He'd bring Buster with him, the hospital staff made a special exception, and the dog would immediately leap onto Leo's bed, curling up beside him. The boy's healing seemed to accelerate whenever Buster was there. He would bury his face in the dog's warm fur and whisper stories to him, his voice growing stronger each day. Miller would just sit in the chair in the corner, watching them, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The emptiness in his own life, an emptiness he hadn't fully acknowledged since his wife passed away, was being filled by this unlikely pair. He was supposed to be retiring, planning a quiet life of fishing and solitude. But a new plan was forming in his heart. The day Leo was discharged from the hospital, Miller was there. The foster family was wonderful, but Miller had already spoken to them, and to social services. He had filed the paperwork. He was a single man with a steady pension and a big, empty house. He wanted to adopt Leo. And, of course, Buster. It was a long shot, they told him. He was older, single. But then they heard the whole story. They heard how he had been the only one to see past the stray dog, the only one to understand the desperate message. They saw the bond between the man, the boy, and the dog. The paperwork was approved in record time. 6 months later, the cold of winter had given way to the bright, hopeful green of spring. Frank Miller, now a civilian, stood in his backyard, throwing a tennis ball. It was chased with boundless joy by Buster, his coat now clean and shining in the sun. Sitting on the back steps, laughing with a delight that filled the air, was Leo. He was healthy and happy, the trauma of his ordeal fading into a distant memory, replaced by the security of a loving home. What began as a routine patrol, a simple observation of a lonely dog, had become a profound transformation. It had given a boy a future, a dog a home, and a man a family. Miller learned that the most important messages don't always come in words. They come in a steady, unwavering presence. They come in a look of desperate hope. They come from the silent, loyal heart of a creature who refused to give up. The world is full of voices crying out for help, and they are not always human. Sometimes, the most heroic soul you'll ever meet is covered in fur and has nothing to offer but his own unwavering faith. The real lesson is not just to look, but to see. Not just to hear, but to listen. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that heroes come in all shapes and sizes. And please, subscribe for more stories that prove the incredible power of connection. Because sometimes, a simple act of paying attention can save a life.